You know, when you read about crime, it often feels like just isolated events, right?
Right, just headlines.
But when you start digging, you find these surprisingly complex structures underneath it all, almost hidden networks.
Yeah, absolutely. And today we're diving into one that's, well, pretty significant. The Sureños.
Exactly. And the sources we've got, they really paint a detailed picture, don't they?
They do. It's a lot of factual stuff, history, how they operate, documented activities. Gives you a solid overview.
Yeah, we're looking at, historical records, reports. The goal here isn't hype, it's understanding.
Getting behind the name.
Right. Where do they start? What actually defines them? How far do they reach? We want to kind of sift through the common ideas and get a clearer view of this whole phenomenon.
Right.
So let's start right at the beginning. Their origins. This goes back a ways, yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
The sources point to 1967, founded in Southern California.
Okay, late 60s.
But what's really key is their link to an even earlier group, the Mexican Mafia, or La M.
Ah, La Emma. I've
Ah,
heard that name.
yeah, they started back in 57, dual vocational institution. And, even now, La M has this huge influence inside and outside prison. Their reputation is considerable.
So the Mexican Mafia came first. Why did they form initially? What was the catalyst?
It's pretty much about survival,
Yeah.
protection, inside the prison system. It's a rough place.
Makes sense.
La M was formed by Mexican-American inmates. A lot of them already had ties to street gangs back home, like in East L.A.
Uh-huh.
They basically wanted to band together for self-defense against other prison groups.
Yeah.
Strength in numbers.
Right, a kind of solidarity.
Yeah.
So how does that lead to the Sureños specifically?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Inside the California prisons, this big split started happening
Ugh.
between Mexican-American inmates from Southern California and those from the North.
A regional thing, inside prison.
Yeah, and apparently there were some pretty deep-seated biases. Southerners kind of looked down on Northerners as being maybe less sophisticated, rural, and the Northerners, they saw the Southerners as maybe too Americanized, losing their roots maybe.
Wow, so just regional differences blowing up.
Exactly. And what started as like internal prison friction became this major fault line for basically all Hispanic gangs in California. It's kind of wild how that small division had such huge consequences.
Okay, so these existing tensions were simmering. How did the Mexican Mafia fit into that north-south divide?
Right. So as La M got more powerful, if members started using the word Sureños, Spanish for Southerners,
Uh-huh.
they used it to label the gang members who were essentially working for them under their umbrella,
Ah, so it was like an identifier for their guys.
pretty much. It was to separate them from the guys from Northern California who were starting to rally around a rival group called Nuestra Familia.
Lutis Familia. So they became the Norteños.
Exactly. Norteños, Northerners.
So Sureños started as an internal prison label tied to Leme.
Precisely. The groundwork was probably laid around 68, but the term Sureños really took off and became common currency in the 70s.
Why then, specifically?
That's when the conflict between the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia really exploded inside the prisons. It wasn't just arguments. It was like full-on violent prison wars.
Wow, okay. So being a Sureño wasn't just about where you were from, it was about which side you were on in this massive, violent conflict, allegiance to La M.
Totally. It became intrinsically linked.
So what's the core identity then? If you asked a Sureño, what does it mean to be one?
The sources are pretty blunt about this.
Yeah.
A common definition you hear is, a Sureño is a foot soldier for the Mexican Mafia.
Foot soldier. That says a lot.
It really does. It highlights the hierarchy, the ultimate authority of La M. It speaks to loyalty, probably driven by a mix of fear and respect.
And this rivalry that started in prison, it sounds like it completely reshaped the landscape for Hispanic street gangs outside, too.
Oh, absolutely. Because of those prison wars, almost every Hispanic street gang in California ended up aligning one way or the other,
Mm-hmm.
Sureño or Norteño.
Really? Almost all of them.
Yeah, very few exceptions. It's kind of this universal alignment now.
You mentioned a couple of exceptions, though.
Right, the main ones noted are the Fresno Bulldogs and then the various Marvia gangs out of East L.A.
Okay.
But the Fresno Bulldogs are kind of unique. They're so big, numbers-wise.
Uh-huh.
They're actually the only Hispanic gang that's considered independent within the whole California state prison system.
Yeah.
They just have the manpower to not have to align with Sureños or Norteños.
That's pretty significant. It speaks to their power. Okay, so from these prison roots and this huge rivalry, we get this big, sprawling Sureño network. What about their identity now? Key characteristics.
Well, ethnicity-wise, primarily Mexican American, which tracks with their origins, right?
Yeah, right.
But it's important to note, they can be multi-ethnic.
Huh.
Some Sureño sets, individual gangs, they do accept members from other backgrounds.
Oh, interesting. So not exclusively Mexican American anymore in all cases.
Yeah, which kind of raises questions about, how that changes things internally or maybe shifts their identity over time.
Hmm. What about symbols, markings, things you'd see?
Yes, definitely. The number 13 is huge, absolutely central.
13. Why 13?
It stands for M, 13th letter of the alphabet.
Ah, for Mexican Mafia, La M.
Exactly. It's a direct, unmistakable symbol of their allegiance to La M. Yeah. It's coded, but everybody involved knows what it means. Tells you a lot about the power structure.
Makes sense. Very direct link. What other markings are common?
You see stuff like SUR, 30s, the Roman numeral, X3, just the number 13, Sur 13, sometimes spelled out like uno tres or tres.
Okay.
And also 3 dots, often in like a triangle pattern, like on dice.
3 dots. You see that sometimes associated with other groups too, don't you? Is it specific here?
It is. In the Sureño context, it's another way to represent 13. Now, look, lots of people might have these tattoos.
Right.
The sources kind of stress that no single tattoo is definitive proof. But the X3 tag, you see that a lot in their graffiti.
Okay.
And ultimately being called a Sureño or Sueña, that's something you have to earn. You got to show loyalty, commitment.
So it's earned, not just claimed. What about clothing? Any specific styles?
Yeah, there are preferences. Blue or gray sportswear seems pretty common.
Like team gear.
Often, yeah. Associated with LA teams, Dodgers, Rams, sometimes Lakers. Makes sense, given their Southern California roots.
Huh.
But it gets interesting regionally. Like the guys known as upstate Sureños, the ones in Northern California,
Yeah.
they might lean towards gear from, say, the Dallas Cowboys, San Jose Sharks, or even the Oakland Raiders.
Huh. Cowboys. That's kind of random.
Maybe, but it shows how the bigger identity can still have these local variations, adapting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Shows flexibility. And you mentioned SER before, and it means more than just South for them.
That's right. Within the group, SUR can also stand for Southern United Raza,
Southern United Raza. Okay.
which, suggests this idea of unity, shared identity, at least in theory.
In theory.
Well, given some of the internal conflicts we'll probably get into, you got to wonder how united that Raza really is on the street level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe more aspirational.
Good point. And graffiti, you mentioned tagging. That's about territory.
Definitely. Big time.
Hmm.
Using graffiti, tagging up walls, it's a very visible way for different Sureño cliques to mark their turf, assert their presence, boundaries.
Marking territory. Okay, that leads right into their geographic reach. Southern California is the heartland, you said. But where else are they? What's the footprint look like now?
So Cal's the main stronghold, no doubt. But they have a really significant presence across a bunch of other states now.
Like where?
California, obviously, but also Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Utah. Basically a big chunk of the Southwest.
Wow, that's already a pretty wide net across the Southwest. Does it stop there?
Nope, it goes further. They have a smaller but definitely present influence in places like Illinois, Oklahoma, Georgia, Oregon, Washington State, Georgia. Okay.
And the sources even say they've spread as far east as New York.
New York.
Yeah.
Seriously. From Southern California roots, that's quite a spread.
It really emphasizes how far this network has reached. And it's not just like in regular communities, is it? There was something else mentioned.
Yeah, this is kind of concerning. They've actually been documented inside the U.S. military.
What?
On bases both here in the U.S. and overseas.
In the military. Wow. That raises some serious questions, doesn't it? Security, how you deal with that.
Absolutely. It suggests a level of infiltration that's pretty unsettling.
Okay. And outside the U.S., any international presence?
Yeah, they do have a presence in parts of Mexico. And they have relationships with drug trafficking organizations down there. The Gulf Cartel is specifically mentioned.
Gulf Cartel. Okay, so links to major cartels. That probably helps fuel their activities, I imagine.
Yeah, likely a big factor in their drug operations, which we should probably talk about.
Definitely. So just to recap the geography, a huge domestic presence documented in over 35 states, plus military presence, plus Mexico connections. That's vast. Within California, is there like a clear line between north and south?
Generally speaking, yeah. The kind of accepted dividing line runs roughly through Bakersfield and Delano. South of that, usually Sureño. North, usually Norteño.
But not perfectly clean cut, right? You mentioned upstate Sureños.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even though that's the general line, you find solid Sureño strongholds up in Northern California. Places like Santa Rosa,
Mhm.
Modesto, often areas with large Mexican immigrant populations. And yeah, those guys are often called upstate Sureños.
Okay. And all these different Sureño groups under this big Sureño banner, they all get along.
Not always. Not even close sometimes. The sources point to lots of conflict, not just with rivals like Norteños, but fights between different Sureño factions.
Really? Fighting each other?
Oh, yeah. There are examples like ongoing beefs in San Francisco's Mission District Sureños versus other Sureños and Sureños versus Norteños.
Let's see.
And then you have the history of intense fighting back in LA neighborhoods, where some of the original sets came from, plus conflicts in places like San Jose, Oakland.
So internal conflict is just part of the reality. There was that specific example in Santa Rosa you mentioned, between Sureño groups.
Yeah, that was about two rival Sureño gangs fighting over a park, Southwest Community Park, a turf war, basically.
Over a park. Wow.
It just shows how localized and intense these fights can be, even within the same larger Sureño identity.
These turf wars definitely point towards, well, underlying activities. What are the main criminal activities Sureños are involved in, according to the sources?
It's, unfortunately, a pretty long list. Drug trafficking is major, arms trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, robbery, car theft, fraud, and then the violent stuff like homicide and assault.
That covers a lot of ground, violent and nonviolent. Where's the money coming from mainly?
The big one seems to be retail-level drug distribution, selling stuff like cocaine, heroin, marijuana, meth, both inside prisons and out on the streets.
Okay. Selling drugs.
And another major source is extortion, specifically extorting other drug dealers, shaking them down.
Extorting other criminals, that sounds dangerous.
Extremely. Yeah. And you mentioned the cartel connections earlier.
Right, the Gulf Cartel.
Yeah, so Sureño members might have direct links, acting as brokers for drug deals, sometimes for the Mexican Mafia, sometimes for their own gangs. That connection to bigger organizations, it definitely boosts their capabilities.
And this structure, you described it as kind of decentralized on the street level. The sources said that makes things hard for law enforcement.
Absolutely. Because it's not like one single pyramid structure on the street, right? It's lots of different cliques and sets, all under the Sureño umbrella, but operating somewhat independently day to day.
So it's hard to target.
Yeah, it makes it really difficult for police to just, take down the whole organization, or even just to limit the influence the Mexican Mafia has over all these street gangs. It's like trying to fight weeds with tons of interconnected roots, not just one main one. Cut one off, others keep growing.
That's a good analogy. So you can disrupt one local group, but the network persists. What have police tried to do?
Well, back in the late 90s, they set up federal task forces, specifically aimed at disrupting the Sureño drug trade.
Did they have much success?
They did make numerous arrests, yeah, and seize significant amounts of drugs and money. So there have been impacts.
But the violence, especially with rival gangs, that hasn't stopped. It leads to deadly outcomes, right?
Tragically, yes. The sources mention it repeatedly. These turf wars and rivalries, they fuel drive-by shootings, murders. It's a cycle of violence that hits communities hard. You got to remember the families, the neighborhoods affected by all this. It's not just stats.
Absolutely. There was that specific law enforcement action in 2004 against the 38th Street gang. What was that?
Right, that was a preliminary injunction. Basically, a court order aimed at known members of that specific gang.
What did it do?
It barred them from doing a whole list of things in public areas, carrying guns, drinking alcohol, tagging graffiti, even possessing certain things. It was a direct shot at disrupting their ability to operate openly in their territory, trying to curb the crime.
A targeted legal tool. And there were specific criminal cases mentioned too, right? Big busts.
Yeah, a couple of examples. In 2009, some Sureños were charged over the deaths of Norteño members up in Richmond, California. One guy pled guilty, got 25 years. Others got serious time, too.
Okay.
Then in 2010, there was this big narcotics sting in California. They arrested 51 Sureños from 8 different gangs.
51. Wow.
Yeah, huge operation. They seized a lot of meth, cocaine, weed, plus guns and cash. The charges were heavy conspiracy to distribute drugs, street terrorism, gun violations, stuff like that. Really shows the scale of their operations and the police response.
Definitely paints a grim picture. Okay, last big area. Alliances and rivalries. Who do Sureños typically work with and who are they fighting against?
The list of allies in the sources is pretty diverse. You've got the 18th Street Gang, Armenian Power.
Wait, Armenian Power? Really? With a Mexican-American group?
Yeah, that one might seem surprising, but alliances aren't always based strictly on ethnicity. Strategic interest maybe. Also, the Aryan Brotherhood is listed.
Aryan Brotherhood. Wow. Okay. Who else?
Avenues, El Monte Flores, Familia 27, Florencia 13, the Gulf Cartel we mentioned, the Mexican Mafia itself, obviously, Mongols Motorcycle Club, Ontario Barrio Sur, Playboys, Puente 13, Santa Monica 13, Tunerville Rifa 13, Vineland Boys. It's a long list.
Very diverse group of allies, some unexpected ones in there, and the main rivals.
Primarily, you're looking at the Bloods, Latin Kings, Norteños, that's the big one. Obviously, Nuestra Familia, their parent organization, and also the Tiny Rascal Gang.
And the Norteño rivalry is the most intense.
By far. Decades long, incredibly violent. That Alvarado's bar shooting is just one example of how deadly that conflict gets.
So it's this whole complex web of alliances and deep, bitter rivalries fueling the violence. It's clear, listening to all this, Sureños are way more than just some local street gangs.
Absolutely. It started from prison dynamics, but it's morphed into this huge, complicated network. They're all over the U.S., even beyond, involved in serious, wide-ranging crime. Their influence is undeniable in a lot of places.
So thinking about that structure, decentralized on the street, but still connected, still expanding, what does that mean long term for communities, for law enforcement trying to deal with it across all these different regions?
That's the big question, isn't it?
And this hierarchy, driven so much by the prison system, what does that tell us about how adaptable these kinds of organizations are, how resilient they can be?
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do these dynamics play out differently in different places? What kind of strategies can actually work against something so widespread, but also so kind of bottom up in its daily function?
Those are definitely some heavy questions to chew on. There aren't simple answers.
Not at all. The way the prison system feeds into it, the way it spreads, it shows just how complex this whole issue is. Hopefully, though, this dive gave folks a clearer, maybe more nuanced picture of what the Sureños actually are.
Definitely. It's a stark look at those hidden structures we started talking about. Thanks for breaking it all down.